Hi there. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm glad you're here, though. I have to warn you, today's case isn't just disturbing, it's haunting. It's a story about trust manipulation and a level of violence that goes far beyond what most of us can imagine. At the center of it all is a woman whose past was filled with pain, and a man who thought he had found love. But what happened behind closed doors during a quiet Thanksgiving weekend would shock even the most seasoned investigators, not just for how it ended, but for what came after the killing. This is the story of Omaima Nelson, and once you hear it, you'll understand why it still echoes decades later. Chapter 1. The Calm. Before the Horror. You know, every time I think I've heard the most bizarre true crime story out there, something new pops up and completely resets the bar. That's exactly what happened when I stumbled on this case. And I'll be honest, it stuck with me. Not just because of how gruesome the details were, but because of how quickly something that seemed ordinary, even romantic, spiraled into something no one could have imagined. This story takes place during Thanksgiving weekend. You'd think that's a time for warmth food, family, maybe a little too much wine, and some awkward small talk. But not for Bill Nelson. For Bill, Thanksgiving was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings. He had just gotten married earlier that year. His new wife was young, beautiful, mysterious. He was so excited that he picked up the phone to call his daughter and invite her over for dinner, to meet the woman who, in his eyes, had brought something fresh and thrilling into his life. That was the last time anyone would ever hear from him. Now, I don't know about you, but there's always something about holidays that makes stories like this hit harder. Maybe it's because there's this collective expectation that everyone's gathered around the table, smiling, carving turkey, pretending to be one big happy family. When the darkness creeps in during those moments, it feels heavier. Like it's not just a crime against one person, it's a betrayal of something sacred. And trust me, this story is all of that and more. It's a case full of red flags, some ignored, some hidden, some waving so loud it's shocking no one saw what was coming. It's the story of a woman with a haunting past, a man who may have seen only what he wanted to see, and a dinner table that never should have been set. So if you're sitting somewhere cozy right now, maybe with a warm drink in hand, buckle in. Because what started as a love story turned into one of the most disturbing true crime cases I've ever come across. Let me take you back to the final days of Bill Nelson and the woman who would soon make headlines not just for murder, but for what she did with his body after. Chapter 2. A Call, a Feast, and Then. Silence. Bill Nelson was 56 years old that year, and if you ask anyone who knew him, they'd probably describe him as larger than life. He was one of those guys who walked into a room and immediately took up space, not just physically but energetically. Loud, warm, full of stories, a big personality. He had this classic Texan charm, the kind that made you feel like he was someone who'd offer you a beer, a story, and a seat at his table all in the same breath. Thanksgiving was important to Bill, and this one felt even more meaningful than most. He had recently married a much younger woman named Omaima. She was beautiful, like genuinely striking. Tall, model-type features, Egyptian accent, exotic allure, she turned heads everywhere she went. To Bill, she was exciting, a whirlwind. She made him feel young again. And like a lot of men who find themselves in whirlwind romances, he leaned into it fast, probably too fast. He was so happy, though. That weekend, he picked up the phone and called his daughter Margaret, bubbling with excitement. He wanted her to come over and meet his new wife. Said they were cooking a big Thanksgiving feast, a real spread. He made it sound like it was going to be something special. His voice was cheerful, upbeat, almost like a teenager in love. Margaret, though, she wasn't feeling it. Not the excitement, not the invitation, not the new stepmom. From what I've read, she had a lot of mixed feelings about the whole situation. Her dad had married this much younger woman in secret, no wedding, no heads up, no hey honey, I'm getting married this weekend. Just a done deal. And it wasn't just the age difference, though. Omaima was barely in her 20s, less than half Bill's age. It was the suddenness, the secrecy, and that gut feeling you can't quite explain, but it lingers. Margaret didn't trust it. She politely declined the invitation. That phone call, it was short friendly enough, but maybe a little awkward. Still, it was her dad, and he sounded happy. Margaret had no way of knowing that would be the last time she'd ever hear her father's voice. No one did. Over the next few days, Bill's phone went quiet. His daughter didn't hear from him again. His neighbors didn't see him coming or going. His red Corvette stayed parked, but he didn't. And then things took a turn, one that no one could have predicted. It started with a car ride. A woman driving a bright red Corvette that didn't belong to her. A few bags in the back seat. And inside those bags, something no one was prepared for. But we'll get to that. The truth is, people vanish all the time. It's horrifying, but it happens. One moment, you're talking to someone planning a dinner. The next, you're realizing they've gone completely silent. And that silence, it's the first crack in the surface, the one that tells you something is wrong. Very wrong. Bill Nelson was a man preparing a Thanksgiving feast. He was in love. He was proud. He wanted to show off his beautiful young wife. And just days later, police would find him, or rather pieces of him, scattered throughout his apartment in ways no one should ever be found. And the person driving that Corvette, it was Omaima. What happened inside that apartment during Thanksgiving weekend is beyond anything you're probably imagining right now. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute. This wasn't even just a murder. It was something darker, something disturbing, something that made seasoned investigators stop in their tracks. Let's go back to where the silence turned into something much louder, the moment police began to uncover what was really going on inside that modest California apartment. Because this is where the nightmare truly begins. Chapter 3. The apartment on Nile Street. When police finally made their way into Bill Nelson's apartment, it wasn't because someone reported a murder. No alarms had gone off. There was no dramatic 911 call. It started with something simpler. A traffic stop, a strange woman behind the wheel of Bill's red Corvette, and a few plastic bags in the back seat that just didn't sit right. The woman was Omaima, his wife, and what was in those bags? Well, let's just say it wasn't leftovers from Thanksgiving dinner. Police said it looked like meat-thick cuts of it wrapped in layers of plastic, but it wasn't from a butcher, not the kind you'd find at a holiday table. They suspected it was human, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Not yet. That alone was enough to get them a warrant, and when they entered the apartment on Nile Street, what they found would haunt even the most experienced officers. I don't even know how to put this lightly, so I won't. Bill Nelson wasn't there. Not in the way we think of a person being there. What they found instead was Bill in pieces, everywhere. His body had been dismembered and scattered around the apartment, stuffed into suitcases, wrapped in newspaper, even shoved into the freezer. They found his torso hanging above the bathtub, arms and legs removed. His chest had been skinned, completely peeled, like meat in a slaughterhouse. And I know that sounds horrible, it is, but this wasn't just a killing. It was a process. There was deliberation in how it was done. Nearby, they found a broken table lamp, a blood-stained iron, and signs of a violent struggle in the bedroom. The mattress was soaked through. The bedposts were splintered. It looked like a war zone. Not a fight. A total destruction. But it wasn't over. The bathroom was disturbing enough, but the kitchen told a story all its own. Pots were left on the stove, one still simmering, another covered but cooling. Inside, investigators found what appeared to be a stew, with vegetable spices, turkey, and what looked unmistakably like human hands. Yes, hands. There were other body parts in the trash mixed with cranberry sauce. A hip bone, flesh, bones that had clearly been cut with purpose. And in the very back of the freezer, wrapped neatly in foil, they found Bill Nelson's head, deep fried, burnt at the edges, charred, cooked. And this is where the case moved beyond murder. Because this wasn't just someone losing control. This was someone taking control, owning every step of the aftermath. Cleaning, separating, cooking, storing, like it was all part of a plan. At that moment, investigators weren't just dealing with a homicide. They were facing something they didn't have a word for. It was grotesque, calculated, and so out of the realm of ordinary violence that some of the officers reportedly had to leave the scene to compose themselves. Bill Nelson had invited his daughter to dinner. That's how this all began. And now here he was, not just dead, but dissected, treated like a thing, not a person, reduced to parts in the very home he shared with the woman he had just married months earlier. It's hard not to wonder what went through his mind in his final moments. Did he know what was happening? Did he trust her until the very end? Or was there a point where it all clicked, where he realized this beautiful, mysterious woman wasn't who she appeared to be? And for Omaima, what kind of person not only kills but cooks? What happens in someone's mind to cross that line? At this point, police had only seen the horror. They hadn't yet unraveled the why, the backstory, the trauma, the manipulation. That would come later, but what they knew standing in that apartment was this: Bill Nelson didn't just die. He was erased. And the person who did it, she hadn't even tried to run. Because Omaima Nelson believed in some twisted way that what she had done was justified. Or maybe she just thought she could get away with it. Chapter 4: Where the Darkness Began. When we hear about someone committing a crime this brutal, this calculated and bizarre, the first question is always the same. Why? How does someone go from living a seemingly normal life to dismembering and cooking their own husband? And I don't think there's ever just one answer to that question. But to even begin to understand what Omaima did, we have to go back. Way back. To where her story started, and it doesn't start in California or even the United States. Omaima was born in Egypt in 1968. She grew up in a small farming village near the southern border with Sudan, a part of the world where resources were scarce and patriarchy wasn't just cultural, it was survival. From an early age, her world was shaped by control and violence. Her father was, by all accounts, abusive, not just to her mother, but to Omaima, too, physically, sexually, repeatedly. She was trapped in a household where cruelty was the norm, where silence was expected, where no one came to save you. And then when she was just 7 years old, something happened that would mark her forever. Omaima was subjected to a practice known as female genital mutilation. It's a deeply disturbing, deeply damaging procedure, and I won't get graphic, but if you've read even a little about it, you know how traumatic it is, physically, emotionally, psychologically. For Omaima, it meant that any kind of sexual experience, anything, was associated with pain. Not discomfort, pain. Trauma wasn't something she carried. It was something she lived inside of. Eventually, her mother did what many women in those situations dream of doing. She found the courage to leave. But divorce doesn't solve everything. They were poor. They had nowhere to go. So they moved to Cairo, to a place known as the City of the Dead. That name isn't poetic. It's literal. They lived among graveyards, families squatting in ancient mausoleums surrounded by tombs and bones. You grow up around death like that, and it gets into your bones too. Omaima lived there through her teenage years, and while the poverty didn't ease, something else began to take shape: her beauty. People noticed her. She had striking features, a quiet presence, and she learned how to use that, how to carry herself like someone who could command a room, even if she still felt powerless inside. And then came the foreigner, an American oil worker, older, wealthier, and maybe to her a way out. He noticed her, and she noticed what his attention could mean. Their relationship escalated quickly. Maybe it was love, maybe it was survival, maybe it was both. But her mother urged her to commit to it. Because after everything, the abuse, the cultural shame around her deflowering, the future that had already been taken from her, this man represented something else: a ticket to the West. In 1986, she left Egypt and moved to Texas with him. Think about that. From a crumbling village surrounded by tombs to America. A country she didn't understand, filled with people she couldn't relate to, speaking a language she barely knew. And whatever she hoped that relationship would be, it didn't last. Not long after arriving, Omaima found herself alone in a foreign country with no support system, no job, and very little English. She had to find a way to survive, so she did what she had learned to do. She relied on the only currency she had ever been taught had value her beauty. Omaima began bouncing between jobs, nannying small modeling gigs. But eventually she started using men. She'd get them to fall for her, earn their trust, and then steal from them. One ex-boyfriend later said she tied him to a chair and held a shotgun to his head, demanding money. He didn't go to the police. He was too embarrassed, and honestly, I think that's part of the story too. We don't talk enough about how men can be victims of domestic abuse and manipulation. He didn't come forward, and maybe if he had, someone would have seen the pattern forming, but he stayed quiet, and Omaima kept moving. She was in many ways a chameleon. She knew how to mirror people, how to play sweet play, helpless play seductive, whatever worked. But underneath, she was unraveling. Every relationship she formed came with a price, and every time she was disappointed or rejected or left alone again, I think something inside her cracked, just a little bit more. 5 years after she arrived in the States, Omaima met Bill Nelson in a bar in Orange County. And if you've ever wondered what happens when someone with deep trauma crosses paths with someone dangerously naive, well, that's exactly where this story is headed. But at this point, Omaima hadn't killed anyone. At least not that we know of. She'd manipulated, stolen, lied, but nothing like what she was about to do. And for Bill, he saw a beautiful woman, half his age, who seemed to genuinely like him, who laughed at his jokes, who said yes to marriage after just a few weeks. Maybe he thought he'd finally found happiness. Maybe he thought he was the lucky one. But the truth is, neither of them knew what was really coming. Chapter 5. Love Red Flags and a Fast Wedding. By the time Omaima met Bill Nelson, she had already been in the United States for a few years. She wasn't new to the game. She knew how to get by, how to spot opportunity, how to turn a quick connection into a lifeline. Bill, on the other hand, had no idea what he was walking into. They met the way a lot of unlikely couples do in a bar. It was 1991, Orange County, California. Think pool tables, neon signs, the low buzz of music, and conversation in the background. And in walks, Bill 6 feet tall, stocky, loud, friendly. A big presence with bright red cowboy boots and the confidence to match. Omaima noticed him, and Bill definitely noticed her. She was gorgeous, tall, elegant, striking cheekbones, long hair, this exotic aura that made her stand out in any room. She had a quiet charm, a flirtatious smile, and that rare ability to make someone feel like they were the only person in the world. For Bill, it must have felt like lightning in a bottle. They hit it off fast, talking, laughing, connecting in that whirlwind way that can feel like fate when you're lonely or chasing something new. It wasn't long before Bill started telling her stories about his red Corvette parked outside, about land he supposedly owned in Texas, about his plans for a future with someone who appreciated him. He wanted to be seen as successful, generous, larger than life. And Omaima, she gave him exactly what he wanted in return. Looking back, it's hard not to see the dynamic for what it really was. Bill wanted love. He wanted youth, beauty, admiration. Omaima wanted security. She wanted comfort, control, maybe even revenge on the world that had treated her so cruelly. Together they created this illusion of compatibility, but illusions never last long. Within weeks, Bill took Omaima on a road trip to Arizona, and somewhere along that drive, they decided to make it official. No long engagement. No big wedding, just a quick stop at a justice of the peace, a signature, a certificate, and that was it. Husband and wife. From the outside, it probably looked impulsive. A middle-aged man and a stunning young woman racing into marriage like teenagers. But for them, it felt exciting, or at least that's how Bill described it when he called his daughter Margaret. She was confused, and honestly, who wouldn't be her dad had married someone her age, someone he barely knew, and hadn't even told the family until after the fact. There was no introduction, no heads up, just, surprise, I got married. It created tension, not just with Margaret, but with other relatives too. People didn't know what to make of Omaima. Some said she seemed quiet, polite. Others said she came off cold, hard to read. But one thing was certain, she was nothing like Bill's previous partners. Still, Bill was smitten. He brought her around when he could. There's even a story about Omaima meeting some of his kids for the first time while horseback riding. She didn't know how to ride, and at one point she got thrown off the horse. Everyone rushed to check on her, expecting tears or drama, but she brushed herself off, asked for a vodka and some aspirin, and got back on the horse. It sounds funny now, but there was something in that moment, something about how she handled it, that made her seem tough, resilient, like she'd been through worse. Maybe that's what kept people off balance with her. She was hard to figure out. On the surface, she played the role of doting wife, but underneath there was something else. A distance, a calculation. And yet Bill didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He was busy planning a Thanksgiving feast. He told his daughter they were going all out that year, cooking, celebrating, enjoying their first holiday as newlyweds. He was proud. He wanted to show Omaima off. He thought this was the beginning of something good, but in reality it was already the beginning of the end. Within days, Bill Nelson would be gone. Not just missing, gone in a way no one could have imagined. And the woman he had just married, the one who smiled at him across the bar, the one who brushed off a fall from a horse like it was nothing, she would soon be at the center of one of the most horrifying murder cases in California history. What exactly happened behind those apartment walls? And how did a holiday meant for gratitude turn into a crime scene soaked in blood? That's where we're headed next. Chapter 6: Thanksgiving, the Last Supper. There's something about holidays that makes everything feel heightened: joy, stress, pressure, expectation. For some people, Thanksgiving is just turkey and football. For others, it's about starting new traditions, building something special. That's what Bill Nelson wanted this year, something meaningful, something memorable. And in a way, he got it. Just not in the way anyone ever imagined. Bill had big plans. This was going to be his first Thanksgiving with Omaima as his wife, and he wanted it to feel like a celebration. He told people he was planning a full spread the works. Turkey sides, dessert. He even invited his daughter Margaret again. He wanted her to come meet Omaima, finally sit down as a family, but Margaret declined. And honestly, I think something in her gut just didn't feel right. There was too much distance between them lately, too many questions about this new marriage, this whirlwind woman who had stepped into her father's life and seemed to change everything overnight. Still, Bill didn't let that bring him down. He and Omaima went back to their apartment in Costa Mesa, California, ready to enjoy the long weekend together. Just the two of them, newlyweds, in love, or so it seemed. But sometime between Thanksgiving Day and the morning of December 1st, that cozy little apartment turned into something out of a nightmare. The details of what happened inside those walls are still debated because we only have one version of the story, and it comes from Omaima. And her story, it shifted. More than once. What we do know is this: by the time December 1st rolled around, Bill Nelson was no longer alive. And not only was he dead, his body had been butchered, dismembered, and partially cooked. But before police discovered that horror show, before anyone even knew something was wrong, Omaima made a strange decision. She drove to the home of an ex-boyfriend, a man named Jose. And this is where things get even more bizarre, because she showed up at his door in the middle of the day, driving Bill's red Corvette. Jose didn't answer the door right away. He didn't recognize the car, didn't know who was knocking. But a few hours later, she came back, this time pounding on the door. And when Jose opened it, he saw Omaima, disheveled, shaking her clothes, stained her story. Fragmented. She told him she had just escaped from something terrible. That Bill had tied her up. That he'd assaulted her repeatedly over the holiday weekend. That she'd been held against her will, and that she had fought back. She said she had killed him. Out of self-defense. Out of desperation. And maybe for a moment Jose believed her. Maybe he saw the fear in her eyes, the trembling in her hands. But then she asked him for something that changed everything. She needed help getting rid of the body. She told Jose it was already chopped up, packed into bags, ready to go. All she needed was a truck, a ride, a favor. And in exchange, she offered him money, $75,000, and a couple of motorcycles that, according to her, belonged to Bill. Can you imagine being in Jose's shoes in that moment? An ex you haven't seen in ages shows up out of nowhere, covered in cuts and blood, asking you to help move a body. And oh, by the way, here's some cash and a bike. It was like something out of a bad movie, but this was real. And thankfully, Jose knew it wasn't right. He told her he'd help. He pretended to go along with it. But as soon as she left, he called the police. That phone call would change the course of the investigation. It's what led officers to Omaima on the road behind the wheel of Bill's Corvette with plastic bags full of what would later be identified as human remains. In that moment, everything started to fall apart for her. But what really happened inside that apartment? What pushed her to do something so violent, so methodical, so inhuman? Was it really self-defense, or was it something else entirely, something colder, more calculated? The answers, as you'll see, are messy, conflicting, disturbing, and the deeper investigators dug, the darker this story became. Chapter 7. Blood on her hands, lies on her lips. When the police pulled Omaima Nelson over, she probably didn't expect things to fall apart so quickly. Maybe she thought Jose wouldn't call. Maybe she figured she had more time. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. But there she was, driving her husband's bright red Corvette like nothing had happened, even though everything had. And in the passenger seat, in a plastic grocery bag, was what looked like and turned out to be pieces of human tissue, flesh, organs. When the officer asked what was in the bag, Omaima didn't have much to say. And honestly, it's hard to know what you even can say in that situation. What are the words? How do you explain why you're driving around with lungs in your car? Because that's what it was. They later confirmed it. Bill's lungs, blackened from years of heavy smoking, wrapped loosely in plastic like discarded groceries. From that moment on, there was no going back. Omaima was taken into custody, and it didn't take long before investigators had a warrant to search the apartment she shared with Bill. And we already know what they found there: the torso in the bathroom, the hands in the stew pot, the head in the freezer. But what came next was even more twisted, because once she was in police custody, Omaima began to talk. But her story kept changing. At first she claimed Bill wasn't dead at all, that he had gone on a business trip to Florida, that the human remains in the bag, oh, those weren't his, they were someone else's. A man, she said, that Bill had killed. And she was just trying to help clean it up. A completely absurd story, and one that unraveled immediately. Police already knew what they were dealing with. They'd been to the apartment. They'd seen the blood, the body, the chaos. So she changed her story. This time she admitted to killing Bill, but said she had no memory of how it happened, that she had blacked out, gone into a trance. And when she came to there, he was cut up into pieces. She described it like it had all happened to her, not by her, like she had simply stumbled into the aftermath of something she didn't remember doing. But the most chilling part was the way she spoke about it. There was no real remorse, no emotion. She said things like, "I guess I did it," or "something told me to." She even claimed at one point that demons had told her to dismember his body, that they warned her Bill would come for her in the afterlife unless she destroyed his remains. And then she said she had to do it, to save herself. It was surreal, almost theatrical, but also haunting, because mixed in with all the lies and contradictions were these slivers of trauma, of past abuse, of a woman who had been broken long before she ever met Bill. But none of it explained the methodical nature of the crime. This wasn't a panicked stabbing. This wasn't someone lashing out in a moment of rage and then collapsing with guilt. This was someone who took their time, someone who cut carefully, who cooked, who cleaned, who packed bags and tried to barter with a former lover to make the evidence disappear. It was cold, and as the investigators continued questioning her, one thing became clear: Omaima Nelson had done this, all of it. And now they had to figure out why, and whether the trauma of her past could ever justify the horror of what she did. That question, the one about motive, about intention, would soon become the centerpiece of her trial. But before they could bring her to court, they had to piece together the rest of the evidence, and they had to try as best they could to understand the mind of the woman behind the butchered body. Because what Omaima had done wasn't just about survival. There was something else at play, and the answer, it was buried deep in her patterns and in Bill's final hours. Chapter 8. Truth in the Bruises. Once Omaima was in custody, police and prosecutors got to work trying to understand the full picture, and honestly, that was no easy task. There were so many conflicting statements, so many bizarre claims. But in the end, the real answers came not from Omaima's words, but from Bill Nelson's body. That's where the truth was hiding, in bruises, in blood, in the way bones were broken and how ropes had left their marks. Omaima claimed she had been tied up by Bill, that he had assaulted her over the course of the weekend, that she'd been held against her will, and that she had killed him in self-defense. She said she had no choice, that she managed to get one hand free and then struck him with a lamp and a clothing iron to escape. At first glance, it might have seemed plausible. The bedroom was torn apart. The mattress was soaked in blood. Something violent had clearly happened there. But when the medical examiner looked closer, the details didn't line up. Omaima had cuts, yes, scratches, small wounds on her hands and arms. But they weren't the kind of injuries you'd expect from someone who'd been bound for days. And they certainly weren't consistent with the kind of violent struggle she described. But you know whose injuries did match that story, Bill's. He had deep bruising on his wrists and ankles, the kind you see when someone's been tied tightly, and for a long period of time. His body also showed signs of restraint, not attack. It looked like he had been the one tied up, not her. And suddenly the story flipped. What if Omaima hadn't fought her way free from a violent man? What if she had been the one in control all along? Investigators started to piece it together. They believed that Omaima had convinced Bill, maybe as part of some kind of sexual game, to let her tie him up. Maybe he thought it was playful, something exciting. Maybe he trusted her. Or maybe she promised him something he wanted to hear. But once he was restrained, something changed. Maybe she demanded money. Maybe she snapped. Maybe she was never planning to let him go at all. They found a broken lamp and a clothing iron at the scene, both stained with blood and hair. The evidence suggested that Bill had been beaten to death while still tied to the bed. Blunt force trauma, multiple blows to the head. And then the cleanup began. That's the part that still haunts me, the sheer amount of time and effort it took to do what she did. This wasn't quick. It wasn't panicked. She dismembered him carefully, methodically, like she had done it before, like she had planned it. She didn't run. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she got to work separating flesh from bone, cooking parts of him, storing others in the freezer, and disposing of the rest however she could. Hands boiling on the stove, head wrapped in foil, torso bleeding out in the bathtub. And if it weren't for Jose, her ex, if he hadn't called the police, there's no telling how much longer it would have taken to uncover what she'd done. There's this strange line we walk in true crime between trying to understand and not making excuses. Omaima had trauma, deep trauma, and it shaped who she became. But the way she killed Bill, the way she treated his body, that wasn't about survival. It was about control. Maybe for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one tied down. And when that power shifted, it was like something inside her snapped. Something she couldn't put back. The investigation made it clear this wasn't an act of desperation. It was deliberate, violent, and possibly premeditated. The question now was, what would a jury think? Would they believe her story of abuse and survival? Or would the evidence speak louder? That answer would come in court. But before we get there, there's one more layer to this story, and it's maybe the darkest one of all, because as horrifying as the dismemberment was, it might not have ended there. Chapter 9. The Unthinkable. Just when you think a case has hit its most disturbing point, there's more. At this stage, police had collected the physical evidence. They had Omaima in custody. They had the bruises, the blood, the cooked remains. They had her confession, or at least one version of it. But something still didn't sit right. This wasn't just a brutal murder. It wasn't just about power or revenge or rage. There was another layer, something darker, something more primal. And it came to light in the most unexpected way. While awaiting trial, Omaima began meeting with a court-appointed psychiatrist. It was part of a routine psychological evaluation, a standard step in cases like this, especially when mental health becomes a central piece of the defense. In those interviews, she spoke of visions, blood-soaked women with ancient Egyptian features, spirits, messages from the afterlife. She claimed they warned her that if she didn't destroy Bill's body completely, he would return to torment her, that he would find her even in death. It was surreal, like something out of a horror film. But she wasn't done, because during one of these sessions, Omaima made a confession. A new one she hadn't shared with police. She said she had eaten part of Bill. Specifically, she described cooking his ribs slathered in barbecue sauce and said she had tasted them. She told the psychiatrist they were so sweet. I just remember reading that line and freezing. So sweet. It wasn't said with horror. It wasn't some traumatic slip. It came across as almost casual, like someone reminiscing about a strange meal they once had on vacation. There was something about that detail, the flavor, that made it feel real. Too real. Later on the witness stand, Omaima would deny it. She swore she never ate any part of Bill. She said, "I'm not a monster." And maybe that's what she believed. But the damage was done. That quote, the one about the ribs, spread quickly. It became the defining image of the case. Not the red Corvette, not the stew on the stove, not even the head in the freezer. It was the idea that she had eaten him and possibly enjoyed it. That changed everything. Suddenly the public wasn't just horrified. They were fascinated. The media latched onto it and the case became national news. Headlines labeled her a man-eater. Tabloids called her a real-life Hannibal Lecter. And while some of it was sensationalized, the fact remained. Cannibalism was now on the table literally and figuratively. But here's the thing that makes this even more chilling. When medical examiners began piecing together what they could of Bill's remains, they realized parts were missing. A lot of parts. About 100 pounds of him gone, never recovered. Now, did Omaima eat all of that? Probably not. There's no evidence she did. But where did it go? There's no record of her dumping it, no witnesses, no footage. And she never gave a straight answer, so we're left with a haunting possibility. That part of Bill Nelson may have been consumed. That his death wasn't just violent, it was violated on a level that's hard to comprehend. And that leads us to one of the most uncomfortable truths in this case. It wasn't just about death. It was about destruction, about erasure. Omaima didn't just kill Bill, she dismantled him. Piece by piece. Emotionally, physically, symbolically. She took away his ability to be buried, to be mourned, to be whole again. And no matter what she claimed about spirits or visions or trances, there's one thing that was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just the result of trauma. It was control. Total, terrifying control. The trial was approaching, and the defense would lean hard into her mental health, her history of abuse, her fractured past. And yes, those things mattered. Of course they did. No one walks into adulthood from a childhood like Omaima's without carrying deep, invisible scars. But could those scars justify this? Could anything the jury would have to decide? But before they did, they'd have to hear all of it. The abuse, the manipulation, the fantasies, and the final unforgettable meal. Chapter 10. The Trial of 1,000 Questions. By the time Omaima Nelson finally went to trial in December of 1992, a full year had passed since Bill's murder. But even with time, the details hadn't gotten any easier to digest. If anything, they'd only gotten darker, more layered, and more confusing. The prosecution came prepared, and honestly, they didn't have to do much to shock the jury. The crime scene alone told a story most people couldn't begin to fathom. The torso hanging over the bathtub, the pots on the stove, the foil-wrapped head, and of course the part no one could ever forget, the confession to eating part of Bill's ribs. Whether it was true or not, it hung over the trial like a fog. But the defense. They leaned heavily on Omaima's past. They painted a picture of a woman who had suffered her whole life, abused by her father, mutilated as a child, treated like an object in every relationship she'd ever had. They brought in the psychiatrist who had evaluated her in jail, and he testified that she had PTSD, severe trauma, and even signs of psychosis. He talked about the visions, the blood-soaked Egyptian women who told her that if she didn't destroy Bill's body, he would find her in the afterlife. He described her as one of the most disturbed patients he had ever encountered, and part of me believes that. I really do. I think Omaima was deeply broken, that she was carrying more pain than most of us will ever understand. that she may have believed on some level that what she did was necessary to survive or to silence the ghosts she thought were chasing her. But that's where the conversation gets difficult, because mental illness doesn't erase intent, and trauma doesn't always excuse brutality. What Omaima did to Bill, the level of violence, the way she dismembered him, the way she tried to cover it up and barter it away, it was too much, too extreme, too deliberate. The prosecution argued that this wasn't self-defense. It wasn't a psychotic break. It was calculated. They laid out her history, the ex-boyfriends she had manipulated, stolen from, even held at gunpoint. They showed a pattern she used men to survive. And when Bill wasn't who she thought he was, when he didn't have the money, the land, the lifestyle, she snapped. They believed she had tied him up under the guise of sex, just like she had done before. And when he resisted, when things got out of her control, she killed him, not in fear, but in rage, and then she destroyed him. The jury sat through all of it, the gruesome photos, the testimony, the contradictions in Omaima's own words. One day she said she remembered everything. The next day, nothing. One moment she was a grieving, terrified woman. The next, she was laughing with her lawyers in the hallway. I can't imagine what that must have been like, to sit there and try to make sense of all of it. To look at a woman who didn't look like a monster and decide if she was one. When Omaima finally took the stand, she cried. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't remember killing Bill, only waking up to find him dead in pieces. She swore she never meant for any of it to happen, and maybe on some level she believed that. But when the verdict came in, the jury didn't buy her story, not completely. They found her guilty of second-degree murder, not first, which meant they believed the killing wasn't premeditated, but they also didn't believe it was justified. The dismemberment, the cleanup, the attempt to cover her tracks, it all pointed to someone who knew what they were doing. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Not a short sentence, but not death. Not even life without parole. It left a lot of people with mixed feelings. Some felt like she got off easy, considering what she did. Others believed she was as much a victim of her past as Bill was a victim of her present. Some people even thought she deserved help, not prison. And honestly, I think all of those things can be true at the same time. Because this case isn't clean. It's not black and white. It's a mess of trauma manipulation, fantasy, and horror. It's the kind of story that forces you to sit with your discomfort, because there are no easy answers here. Bill Nelson didn't deserve what happened to him. That much is clear. And Omaima Nelson, she never got the help she needed before it was too late, and once it was too late, she made sure there was no coming back. Chapter 11. After the sentence. After the silence. You'd think that once a sentence is handed down, the story ends. That justice, in whatever form it takes, brings a sense of closure. But the truth is, stories like this never really end. They linger. In the courtroom, in the media, in the memories of the people left behind. And in this case, it even lingered behind bars. After her conviction, Omaima Nelson was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, a maximum security prison. She was only 24 at the time. Just 24 years old, with a sentence that could keep her locked away for the rest of her life. For a while, she stayed quiet. There were no interviews, no media appearances, just silence. And then in 2006, she came up for parole. At the hearing, she once again claimed that Bill had been abusive, that she had killed him out of fear for her life. She brought up her childhood trauma, her PTSD, the years of pain that came long before Bill ever entered the picture. But the board wasn't convinced. They denied her release, stating that she still posed a danger to society, that the level of violence in her crime showed a deep and unresolved instability. 5 years later, in 2011, she tried again, and this time something strange came to light. During the hearing, it was revealed that while in prison, Omaima had met a man, someone from the outside, a pen pal. They exchanged letters for months, maybe years, and eventually they got married. Yes, you heard that right. She got married in prison. The man, whose name was never made public, was reportedly in his 70s. A retired professional of some kind, and according to several sources, wealthy. Not billionaire rich, but rich enough. Wealthy enough to get attention. wealthy enough to raise eyebrows. They even had conjugal visits, which is still hard for me to wrap my head around. A woman who dismembered and possibly ate her husband, granted the privilege of physical intimacy in prison. But here's where it gets even more surreal. That man. He died shortly before Omaima's 2011 parole hearing, and according to rumors not confirmed but circulated enough to mention, he left her money. Quite a bit of it. It's almost too bizarre to believe that even after everything, after the crime, the trial, the sentence, Omaima still managed to find someone to love her, to marry her, to leave her something behind. And it makes you wonder, was she still playing the same game? Was it manipulation? Was it survival? Or was it somehow something real? I don't know. I really don't. Today, Omaima Nelson is still incarcerated. She's in her 50s now. No new parole hearings have made headlines since the last one, and she's mostly faded from the public eye. But every so often her name comes back up. Someone brings her up in a conversation about cannibalism, or extreme domestic crimes, or the most shocking murder trials in California history. She's one of those names infamous, but not household. Strange enough to be unforgettable, but obscure enough to fade unless you go looking for it. And maybe that's what makes her story so unsettling. Not just the crime, not just the details, but the fact that someone like Omaima could slip through the cracks, could live among us, could fall in love, get married, make someone feel special, and then do what she did. It's a reminder that not all monsters look like monsters, that some of the most disturbing crimes don't start with a scream. In the night, they start with a smile across a bar, and maybe that's the part that chills me the most. Because, for Bill Nelson, love wasn't just blind, it was fatal. Hi there, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. I'm glad you're here, though. I have to warn you, today's case isn't just disturbing, it's haunting. It's a story about trust manipulation and a level of violence that goes far beyond what most of us can imagine. At the center of it all is a woman whose past was filled with pain, and a man who thought he had found love. But what happened behind closed doors during a quiet Thanksgiving weekend would shock even the most seasoned investigators, not just for how it ended, but for what came after the killing. This is the story of Omaima Nelson, and once you hear it, you'll understand why it still echoes decades later. Thank you for sticking with me through this incredibly dark and complicated case. Omaima Nelson's story isn't easy to process, not just because of what she did, but because of what it says about how trauma, power, and control can twist into something unrecognizable. Bill Nelson didn't deserve what happened to him. And while we can try to understand Omaima's past, it doesn't erase the horror of her actions. If anything, it reminds us that unhealed wounds can become weapons, and that sometimes the most terrifying stories don't come from strangers in the night, but from the people we let into our hearts. If this case moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more deep dives like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story we uncover here on True Crime Echoes. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and take care of each other.